Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Hollywood Climate Summit. On behalf of young entertainment activists, I welcome you all to the summit, and we are so thrilled to have you here today. I'm Tanita, Janina, Enderes. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm one of the founding board members of Yeah. Um, in an effort to make this summit more accessible for everyone, I will describe shortly how I look. I'm a Caucasian woman with blonde, long hair. I have bangs that probably should be cut. They're getting a little bit long. I have green eyes and sort of a long face. I have red lipstick on today, and I'm wearing a cream shirt. I'm excited to kickstart this summit with the climate world building panel and invite and welcome an extraordinary group of people to this panel. We humans are hardwired for stories. Stories are powerful. We think in stories, and they guide our beliefs and actions. We remember the stories by which we become who we are. Stories from our past shape who we are today. Stories from today can help shape our future. Stories paint a vision of possibility. It's a pivotal time to change the narrative and build the demand and vision for transformation into our culture. World building can allow us to tell stories that will help shape a future we really want. Before we kickstart the panel, I will share an image. In 2018, Amanda Gorman, the first ever American Youth Laureate, presented her original 4-minute poem, Earthrise, as part of the Climate Reality Project 24 Hours of Reality campaign. Named after the Apollo 8, 1968 photo of the Earth rising from behind the moon, Gorman's poem on climate change is a passionate call for action. It points to a pivotal moment in human history. The first Earth Day was held in 1970. And in 1972, the blue marble was the first clear image of the Earth. It was originally taken upside down by the crew of Apollo 17. Earthrise is the moment we first really witnessed our planet from the outer space. We began to understand and remember our connection to Earth and to take action to save our planet and ourselves. It shifted human consciousness and offered a perspective that transcended boundaries. So to remind ourselves and how Amanda, and to put that into beautiful words and to honor our work, I have the pleasure to welcome my dear friend Emma Ko, who's going to do a poem recitation of this work of Amanda's today. So without further ado, please, Emma, get started.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emma Ko, and I go by she, her, hers. I'm a production designer as well as an artist. I have some community shows that I've been part of. And today I will be, I'm wearing a amber colored orange headband with gold hoops and a floral robe with a black top. And today I will be sharing Amanda Gorman's Earthrise. On Christmas Eve, 1968, astronaut Bill Anders snapped a photo of the Earth as Apollo 8 orbited the moon. Those three guys were surprised to see from their eyes our planet looked like an Earthrise, a blue orb hovering over the moon's gray horizon with deep oceans and silver skies. It was our world's first glance at itself, our first chance to see a shared reality, a declared stance and a commonality, a glimpse into our planet's mirror, and as threats drew nearer, our own urgency became clearer. As we realized that we hold nothing dearer than this floating body we all call home. We've known that we're caught in the throes of climactic changes, some say, will just go away, while some simply pray to survive another day. For it is the obscure, the oppressed, the poor, who, when the disaster is declared done, still suffer more than anyone. Climate change is the single greatest challenge of our time. Of this, you're certainly aware. It's saddening, but I cannot spare you from knowing an inconvenient fact, because it's getting the facts straight that gets us to act and not to wait. So I tell you this not to scare you, but to prepare you, to dare you, and to dream a different reality, where despite disparities, we all care to protect this world, this riddled blue marble, this little true marvel, to muster the verve and the nerve to see how we can serve our planet. You don't need to be a politician to make it your mission to conserve, to protect, to preserve that one and only home that is ours, to use your unique power to give next generations the planet they deserve. We are demonstrating, creating, and advocating. We heed this inconvenient truth because we need to be anything but lenient with the future of our youth. While this is a training in sustaining the future of our planet, there is no rehearsal. The time is now, now, now. Because the reversal of harm and the protection of a future, so universal, should be anything but controversial. So Earth, pale blue dot, we will fail you not. Just as we chose to go to the moon, we know it's never too soon to choose hope. We choose to do more than cope with climate change. We choose to end it. We refuse to lose. Together we do this and more, not because it's very easy or nice, but because it is necessary. Because with every dawn we carry the weight of the fate of this celestial body orbiting a star. And as heavy as that weight sounded, it doesn't hold us down, but it keeps us grounded, steady, ready. Because an environmental movement of this size is simply another form of an Earthrise. To see it, close your eyes, visualize that all of us leaders in this room and outside of these walls or in these halls, all of us change makers, are in a spacecraft, floating like a silver raft. In space, we see the face of our planet anew. We relish the view. We witness its round green and brilliant blue, which inspires us to ask deeply, wholly, what can we do? Open your eyes, know that the future of this wise planet lies right in sight, right in all of us. Trust this earth uprising. All of us bring light to exciting solutions never tried before, for it is our hope that implores us at our uncompromising core to keep rising for an earth more than worth fighting for. Thank you. And next is our Leung, a world builder and my professor from SCI-ARC.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Emma, and thanks for kicking us off. Tanita invited me to help moderate this panel and to co-host, and it's a pleasure to be with you, but also really an honor to be involved in such a fantastic endeavor from the young entertainment activists and the Hollywood Climate Summit. It's such an important project, and just to be a part of it is really a thrill. So thank you. My name is Leung. I'm a speculative architect and director. I am sitting in a renovated garment factory in downtown Los Angeles. You can see windows behind me. I am a male with stubble on my face, gray headphones, a green camouflage shirt, he, him. Thanks everyone. Tanita, should I start? Should we start with introductions from the panelists and then we launch in?
Yes, that would be great.
Fantastic. I think we're going to Holly. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Holly. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm an assistant professor of environment and sustainability at a university in Western New York, in Buffalo. But I'm here because I'm a writer. I work on climate futures, and I have short brown hair. I'm in a blue-toned room, and I am very happy to be here with you all.
Jeremy.
All right, hello. I'm Jeremy Kamal. He, him pronouns. I am dark-skinned. I have also some stubble on my face. I'm wearing a gray cap. I have a lovely plant next to me, to the right of me, to the name of which I forgot. And I'm located in a nice small apartment here in Glendale, California. I'm a creative director, visual artist, and director whose work really is located around the intersection of Blackness and ecology. I love to talk about the roles of culture and the relevance it has in the shifts of our ecology. So thanks for having me, Tanita and Leung. It's an honor to be here.
And Andrew.
Hello, everybody. My name is Andrew Juliang. My pronouns are he, him, his. My physical description is I'm a Chinese American, peachy colored. I'm bald. I have a beard. I'm wearing a black polo today. And if you can see in the video, welcome to my home office. I wish I could clean up for this, but this is the best I could do for now. I am a Hollywood concept designer with about over 20 years of experience in the industry, and the last 10 years working specifically as a concept artist. Some of my more recent work includes concept design for Lion King, Mulan, The Black Panther, Spider-Man Homecoming, Captain America Civil War, and more recently Finch, that's about to be set to release on Apple Plus, starring Tom Hanks in November. I recently completed a short film called The Chemical Factory. It's an animated documentary that bridges the gap between Chinese cultural revolution and the recent COVID-19 pandemic, and has received a few awards and is currently making its rounds to the festivals.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you for joining us. What we're going to do, we wanted to foreground the conversation. So for the audience watching, if you want to find out any more about the work of our fantastic panelists, please go on a Google adventure, track down Holly's book, watch all of Andrew's films and Jeremy's videos. Please enjoy. What I wanted to do, though, is start by engaging the panel in a conversation around the themes that Tanita introduced, particularly to lead from Emma's rendition of the Earthrise poem. I wanted to start with that moment where we're reminded that an image of the world indeed can make the world. The way that image defined a generation's relationship to the planet that they're spinning around the sun on was really critical. And it makes me think that we now need new images, because we very much occupy a very different world to the one that we did in 1968. Climate change then was of a future. It is now a visible slow motion catastrophe that we are all participants of. And the massive inequality, systemic racism, all of the other issues that we're faced are either caused by or certainly exaggerated by climate change. So many of you are image makers. Holly is of course writing about a reconceptualization of the planet. I wanted to start with encouraging to talk about whether or not you feel that this moment in time demands of us particular types of work. Do you feel a responsibility to engage with these issues and start to be a part of the necessary cultural shift that needs to happen in order for us to imagine a new kind of Earthrise? Maybe it's good to start with you, Holly, because your work, and particularly your book, After Geoengineering, literally reimagined the conceptualization of the planet as something that needs to be engineered in a way in order for us to sustain human life.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that this time demands a lot of us, but everybody I know seems up to the task. So there's a silver lining there, right? Some beautiful work is coming out. I think that, I was starting from the point of collaborating with a lot of scientists who are communicating things in terms of graphs and figures and jargon. And I really saw a need to translate some of those climate futures that they would project on a graph to what that means for an individual or a family, a group, living in this world. And that's been the starting point for some of my work.
Can you talk a little bit about after geoengineering and the sort of engineering that you're speculating on and that you're researching and writing that is in many ways necessary to continue the planet?
Yeah, so I started off with exploring both solar geoengineering, which is the idea of blocking some fraction of incoming sunlight to cool the Earth. At first, just because it seemed like such a radical idea, but I went to the climate conference in Copenhagen back in 2009, and I noticed that there were a lot of side events with high-level people talking about this like a plausible thing. And meanwhile, most people hadn't heard about it. So that was kind of my first cue. But then I started thinking about carbon removal technologies. So approaches that can take carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into ecosystems or put it back underground, which is also something that's pretty abstract when you first hear about it. But it would require a pretty vast new infrastructure for moving around carbon dioxide, as well as really big changes to how we use land, how we farm, that directly impact people all around the planet. So trying to bring those social dimensions to light among the scientific community, while at the same time, talking through these implications with people on the ground in different landscapes. And I think world building is one part of this work.
Yeah, and Jeremy and Drew, I mean, Jeremy, your work is very much engaged with trying to frame or visualize a new cultural relationship to landscape, and Drew, your most recent personal project is also a project with a social impact in mind. And maybe you both want to talk about any responsibility or role you see that you can play in today's context.
Well, I can start first if you don't mind, Jeremy. It's definitely interesting because recently a lot of the films I work on are actually a lot of times. I mean, obviously, there's the more visible stuff like the Marvel stuff, but they have been working on other smaller movies where we focus on designing what's called a near future, or trying to present a near future. And oftentimes when we're working on these films, we're often having to do research about what possibly could happen in the near future. And the scary thought is that we always have some kind of a bit of a, I wouldn't say, sort of a sad view towards the future, in the sense that we do accept that climate change is a reality. It is already here. It's not something that is a warning. We are now living through it. An example of that right now, you have entire communities in Los Angeles right now we have people dying from something as simple as heat exhaustion, by the fact that now we just have extreme weather events. That's just it. During the summer, it's going to be extremely hot. During the winter, it's going to be extremely cold. And before, in a city like Los Angeles, which was fairly what you would call, the temperature was fairly controlled, because of these extreme weather events, we now have to account for things that communities haven't designed for. And just to give you an example, like I'm working on a movie that's actually coming out soon called The Finch, is set in a post-apocalyptic future. The reality is that we are quickly arriving closer to that sooner than we would like. I remember about 10 years ago, I worked on a documentary called Life After People, where we reimagined what would happen if the human population, it was for the History Channel, and it was basically, my responsibility at that time was to conceptualize and make map paintings of what it would look like if New York City, if the entire population of people just suddenly disappeared. How would the entire city like New York City would just evolve really quickly. And it used to be like 10, 20 years ago, if you were to depict something like that, it would still look like the realm of fantasy. But the sad truth is, because these things are becoming more and more real, 10, 20 years ago, when you tried depicting these things, you wouldn't accept that as real if you saw it on the screen. But now when you start depicting it, it's becoming so ubiquitous that you will now starting to accept that, yes, these things look real because that is actually what is happening. And because of that, things that would seem kind of fantastic back then now have become commonplace. But at the same time, as a concept designer, like, part of my role is actually to design aspirational images. And I think there is a possibility of turning it around. And through storytelling itself, people don't realize how powerful it is to sort of, in some sense, create what I would call kind of an inception into the culture of like what it could be and what we could possibly strive for. I admit right now I just threw out a bunch of things that we could probably end up talking about, but I think it's a good time for me to just hand over the mic to Jeremy.
No, Drew, I think that was great, and I love how you're talking about just through the lens of concept art, how you're grappling with these issues in that context. I think it's very apropos to the entire discussion. And in terms of the work, there's Birth of a Nation, the original Birth of a Nation that we all know, which is responsible for a lot of the ideology, the racist ideology that we're going through in the United States, and potentially also has exacerbating effects worldwide, or rippling effects worldwide. And those films, such as Birth of a Nation, have like actual material effects in our world. They begin to govern how communities are then isolated and bordered next to very precarious areas, like edges of coasts that are flooding or what have you, New Orleans, among many other things. And then you also have on the other side where you have a deliberate piece of media aimed at making a cultural shift and making a cultural imprint and then having a material effect. You have indirect ones like Blade Runner and Star Trek. And we see now Star Trek influencing magnates like Jeff Bezos, who can now create the Blue Origin project out of this kind of nostalgia for this film. And I think these examples, Blade Runner, we saw the Cybertruck from, what is the guy's name? Elon Musk. We saw the Cybertruck from Elon Musk, and the exact correlation between Blade Runner. We see now that once given the correct amount of capital, the worlds that we kind of put in film begin to manifest, or once given a certain type of message or through the use of fear, these worlds that we kind of entertain in entertainment are actually becoming the worlds, as you were talking about, Drew, the worlds that we're starting to actually recognize and enter into or already occupy. So I definitely think I don't know if it's like, I don't have necessarily that deliberate agenda. It's my agenda and my work is very personal. It's trying to juxtapose images of Blackness in contexts that we don't normally understand and perceive them. And I don't do that job perfectly. I could still probably do more work on that. But I think that image itself has the power, holds a lot of power. And that's how the work started out. I used to just rip music videos and then take off the music and then change the narrative on top of it, just as an exercise of visualizing. And because at the time, music videos were using a lot of very bucolic and wilderness landscapes in their backdrops, in particular, the music videos of Black artists. And so I would use that imagery to create like a new narrative on top of it. And I think there is power in just that process of imaging, but I think that it is worth in my work to actually keep pushing the bar as to, I'm trying to get past the first layer of, can we just acknowledge the ecological relevance of Black culture? That's it. You know what I mean? And off that simple basis and working with those images, then there's the next step of how to do it in the most responsible way, which I have not figured out. But I think it does have implications, as we see with other films. So,
yeah, I think the point of introducing world building as a panel into an event like the Hollywood Climate Summit is to make this argument that no images are benign, right? And I think that's one of the great tragedies of contemporary Hollywood, is that such an extraordinary platform stories with such power that have the capacity to make us laugh or cry. Such emotive mediums are often wasted in forms of kind of abstract escapism, or just the economy that makes the machine tick over. So I'm reminded though with your comments about how processes of world building, imaginary worlds, and science fiction can be scaffolds to help us to climb to the futures that we want to be inhabiting. I mean, sometimes they're cautionary tales, sometimes they're aspirations, but we can launch these fictions into the world with enough force that they might find traction. And as you mentioned, Jeremy, there's the long history to the way that such fictions have percolated up into reality. And it's such an extraordinary and powerful process. And with that in mind, I'm mindful that some of the audience may not quite understand the term world building in the way that we're framing it, or in the way that your practices support, but maybe you can reflect a little bit about your own practice and some of the tools or processes that you use to create images of the future, and whether those images are dystopias, and do you see the value in those dystopian images, or the difficulty with creating utopian images? I mean, Drew, so much of the work that you've created, the imaginary worlds for such extraordinary IP like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, so visual and visceral. Maybe you can talk a bit about how you approach those kind of projects, and just what your process is when you're starting to scaffold these imaginary futures.
First of all, I want to quickly comment on something that Jeremy has said, and I just kind of want to jump off. Jeremy makes a really good point about the fact that, as benign as we think these images are, they do have an effect culturally. And I'd like to talk about my process for how I come up with a lot of these things. A lot of these things is just, obviously, they're speculative, right? It's a lot of what would happen if we did this. And where I start to use my talents as a concept designer, where I literally use every single tool that's available to me as possible to put out these images. I'll use a bunch of 3D software. More recently, I've started using Unreal as a real-time visualization tool and whatnot. So there is not one particular process. I'll literally use every single tool available, and really at the end of the day is to present that image, to present that particular vision of a possible future or a speculative future. But the reason why I want to talk about going back to what Jeremy said about images are in some ways inspiring what the future is and how powerful it is perhaps even us as designers working in Hollywood, we can start reimagining, we can stop the cyclical nature of the trauma of going forward by starting to make small changes in our design moving forward. And what I mean specifically is that, just to give you an example, there's a common trope that you see in sci-fi of like robots, right? And the idea of robots, is not new. I mean, we saw it since the late 1800s with like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Prometheus, in the sense that like it's always about the human creating another human artificially and whatnot. And it's funny, even with all the recent advancements in robotics and even in science fiction, at the end of the day, people fail to realize that really the best robots out there aren't robots, but are actually people. People are actually the most efficient machine out there. And we fail to recognize that. We're always constantly trying to build androids, trying to build things that replicate us. But in reality, we forget that humans are actually physically everything in every way much better at that than actually building a robot. I will go a step even further, talking about planet Earth. We're always talking about building spaceships and going to other planets or traveling through space. And we forget that we already live in the best spaceship, which is planet Earth, that's traveling through space. And if we start to realize, in the sense that because we are living on this, basically the best spaceship, maybe we should start realizing we should stop doing things that could. Because certainly when you imagine being on a spaceship, you think about things like oxygen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You always think about the dangers of traveling through space. But really, Earth has already been really good at doing that, and maybe we should be taking care of that first. The reason why I'm bringing this up and trying to bring up this idea that I want to put forward is the fact that, a lot of my work not only extends within Hollywood, but I've also been part of huge civic design projects where they look to Hollywood for inspiration for big ideas. And the one thing I always come back to that I've noticed is that us humans as designers is that there's a certain hubris about us, that we tend to have a tendency to want to make our imprint on the earth without realizing what that imprint is. Like we always want to make a huge statement, from building giant walls like the Great Wall of China, et cetera, to things that really affect ecologically what ends up happening. Just because out of sheer hubris, we want to make a statement that has an impact that would last hopefully forever, right? And perhaps maybe in some ways that we need to stop this cycle of trauma by rethinking what is our relationship as humans to the environment around us. Perhaps if we stop looking at it as humans trying to make an imprint, maybe we can work with nature in some ways. And not unlike some of the work that Jeremy has shown, where it's more about us as humans working with nature and making imprints that way, as opposed to trying to make a statement, a lasting scar in the best spaceship we could ever possibly be in. Hopefully that makes sense, what I just said. Once again, I threw out a lot of stuff.
Jeremy, can you talk a little bit about, that's great, Drew. Jeremy, can you follow up and talk a little bit about how you work and start to imagine these worlds?
For sure. Thanks for the quotable. We already got the best spaceship. We're referencing that. So there's an artist, Arthur Jaffa, that some of you may be familiar with, and he was saying, he said something that's just phenomenal. He said, sometimes, I think I may be obsessed with apples and I may be doing all this work around apples until I juxtapose the apple next to a fire truck or a fire hydrant, and then I realize I'm obsessed with the color red. And I think that is a big process of how I world build. It's bringing all of these different images together to understand what it is I'm actually interested in. So I took images of black bodies and I took images of vast wild landscapes, and I begin to just bring them together and kind of not question them. Just allow myself to have these images be brought together because I haven't seen them yet. And then slowly that develops into something that I really never expect, which is right now the work that I'm doing is in terms of the Mojo world build that I'm constructing, where it originated as just an exercise in images and an exercise in seeing images of blackness next to images of landscape. It then became a conversation of leisure and labor. It became a conversation of what is the Black relation to landscape and its kind of origin in Black America specifically. And it's one of labor. We all know the slave practices that kind of brought our American landscape to be. And then now in the future, I'm trying to understand what that new relationship is. Now I understand it must be contextualized around the idea of leisure. And so I think just in my process is bringing these images together without questioning them and allowing the narrative to kind of develop the more that I start to overlay these images. It was like I was looking at one relationship in the future, but then I'm bringing in a contemporary relationship with music videos, but then I look at a past relationship and I see a bunch of slave bodies in the field, and slowly a new narrative begins to emerge, and I think it begins to ground the world build a little bit more. If that's just kind of like a glimpse into my process, if that's answering the question, hopefully that hits it.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Jeremy. And Holly, I mean, I had the pleasure of collaborating with you and to a certain extent on my most recent imaginary world, a project called Planet City, which is a speculation on a single city for the entire population of the Earth, as planned to kind of degrow or retreat from our planetary sprawl into one central hyperdense metropolis as a means to leave space for rewilding and other species. You generously offered an essay for the Planet City book, and I guess it reminds me, and part of what we were trying to do with the project was to literally imagine and project this thought experiment of what it would mean to retreat into one city, to return the entirety of the Earth to a planetary scale national park. And we grounded this imaginary world, this speculation, in the real science and infrastructure and technological systems that would be required to make it work, as a means to say that climate change is no longer a technological problem. That in our fiction, there is no science fiction nuclear fusion reactor or some lighter than air material that allows buildings to float. All of the science and tech that makes the city work at this scale is actually already here. And all we do is just relieve the political roadblocks or the lack of cultural investment that currently holds them back, and we just project them rolling out at these kind of planetary scales. And it suggests that the front line of climate change is actually now a political and cultural conversation. So maybe in the context of world building, you can reflect a little bit on how, in your discipline as a geographer and environmental social scientist, imagination and storytelling becomes a critical and necessary part of the science as well. Would that be true to say?
Well, I think it is a necessary part of doing what the science tells us to do. So maybe I'll speak on that first, and then I'll make another point. But right now we're at a point where we have this kind of scenarios used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but we also have increasingly detailed roadmaps put out by teams of really good scientists that spell out exactly what we need to do to curb warming, say to 1.5 degrees, or to get to net zero by 2050. So you can find out, which facilities like coal plants need to be closed first. You can look at maps with all this stuff of, here's how many heat pumps need to be switched out for old furnaces. Here's, so we have this picture, right, of all this data. And I think that you can imagine some of these changes as being very dystopian, and they're actually striking some people as dystopian in this country. So we have, over 100 jurisdictions that have passed laws restricting renewables because they're finding these things to be an imposition rather than an opening of a future. So that's part of where we need the storytelling if we want to actually get all this stuff built, if we want those transmission lines permitted, if we want this new grid. We have to get those stories out there so that people understand this as a way to freedom rather than something that's blocking their landscape or taking, their farmland or whatever. So I think that's one part of it. I'm actually wary of storytelling in science in terms of narrative sometimes leading the science astray. I would actually prefer there to be less narrative, because sometimes now with this social media atmosphere and a neoliberal academy where there's not enough jobs, people are competing for grants, they're competing for resources, they have to tell kind of a big story about whatever they're doing. And that's a diversion from actually doing like unbiased science. So I think we need imagination in science. I'm not sure we need storytelling in the science. I think we need storytelling, to make the science have an effect.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, it's a very useful and necessary caveat as well. But I guess the reason that you flag that up is because we are at the moment in a context of kind of the best fiction seems to find traction somehow, and narratives of fear are more pervasive on media platforms than narratives of hope. And at the very least, people find solace in storytelling and fictions that just make them feel better, as opposed to confronting some of the necessary and difficult realities. And it reminds me that aesthetic practice and the sorts of image making that we're talking about, or even began with Earthrise, really can play important roles in cutting through some of that complexity. I mean, I use the phrase in my own work, data dramatization, as a way of moving from the sort of data visualization that often happens in traditional science. Data visualization being trying to identify patterns in complex information so that an audience can start to identify and connect to it. but rather data dramatization is trying to imbue those patterns and imbue that science with emotion, so that audiences can start to define their own relationship to the content and can understand them as being implicit within it. I don't know, and I think that's something that the machine of popular culture can also play a really critical role in doing, because in many ways it's the S in futures that gives it its criticality. We're not projecting a singular future. There is danger in a single story being told, and it's perhaps multiple voices that are enable us to visualize a whole raft of possible futures that actually become productive. And it starts to suggest to me the way that collaboration might also be an important part of the practice of world building. And perhaps some of the panelists can speak on that a little bit, this idea of multiple voices and the necessity to represent multiple futures, something that Hollywood isn't really great at right now. The dystopian cyberpunk narrative becomes a placeholder for every future at the moment, but it doesn't need to be so. So I wonder if maybe Drew or Jeremy, you can talk a little bit about how collaboration and multiplicity is important in your own practice of world building.
First of all, I want to agree with Holly about how it probably a narrative in general and the social media could be mucking up science trying to be unbiased. That is the issue. I do think that probably the best way right now to deal with climate change is the technology is already here. We have the ability to reverse it if we wanted to, but the issue is definitely, it is more, unfortunately, having to change hearts and minds. And it's not so much about needing the facts, because the facts are already here. It's the difficulty, the uphill battle is the cultural shift that needs to happen to get everyone on board. And as much as Hollywood like to pretend that it doesn't have any responsibility in doing that, it does. It really does. Everything from representation culturally to even putting up a picture, it does have an effect. And that's why we need to stop thinking that Hollywood doesn't have an effect on us. And this brings me to the next thing I wanted to talk about, actually, and I think Holly had brought up a good point, is you do talk about a lot of data and whatnot. And for me, I'll be perfectly honest with you. I will say right now, I'm kind of dumb when it comes to the science of finding things. When I quote unquote say I do research, it's not real research. It's looking it up on Google and whatnot. And the reason why I bring this up is that I was wondering if there's any places for someone like me who is like trying to create a speculative fiction. In fiction, is there a resource or some resources of where I could get good data beyond just doing, let's be honest, a Google search, which is not really truly in-depth research?
Holly, do you want to engage in that? If as image makers and world builders, we're trying to ground our speculations in real science, where might we begin? Maybe, I don't know if you feel like comfortable advising on that, but perhaps you could point us into possible directions. Are scientific journals still the bastions of knowledge that they once were?
I mean, scientific journals are great, but the papers will be on like one very niche thing. So you'd have to read a whole bunch of papers to put them together, I think. I think that right now with these commitments to being net zero by 2050 or whatever, pretty much everybody who's making one of those commitments is making a plan for, how they get there. And so there's been some really good studies. There's one that Los Angeles did with one of the national labs called LA 100 that says this is how LA can get to that goal. So I think looking at countries or cities or places that's where I might go first.
Yeah, I'm also thinking that, like, I guess part of my question, Drew, was to start to make an argument for collaborative processes in world building. I mean, we start our process in conversations, and talking to people like Holly, and assembling. I mean, for our Planet City project, what I would describe as a city council of advisors and theorists and thinkers to try and support the work. And what we found through the processes, and that's how we've been all our projects, is that everyone is up for a conversation. And the idea of the genius artist sitting in a room, scribbling away, imagining future worlds is really prehistoric. And the idea of engaging a whole range of voices in the work that we make, and particularly trying to identify and bring in voices that are not normally part of the processes of future making, at least not historically, I think is part of our responsibility as designers. And I think, Jeremy, that's a big part of how you work, and your whole practice is really trying to be inclusive and to bring narratives that are traditionally excluded from the sorts of worlds and future visions we see on our screens into that very space, and to create fictions there. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think this is an excellent conversation on the topic of, I think, to me, what gets me and what kind of where I get hesitant is when we talk about one has to lead or one has to follow. And I think collaboration is a really good word, because the moment we talk about the kind of storytelling having as parameter of being grounded in actual science, I immediately think of accessibility and who has access to the knowledge of that type of thing and that narrative, and who's able to speak on those topics with fluency versus other groups. And I think there is some, productivity in that imaginative aspect. So, and I think it's less about one is better than the other, and more about that word that you're talking about. It's a real collaboration. I think it's about respect, a mutual respect for one another's field, a mutual respect for me as a non-scientist to actually collaborate with those who are immersed in that field in a real way. We're actually working on a project, an incubator project, looking at the future of Black culture in the context of space, and trying to understand how we don't reproduce the same ideologies that we do on Earth in the context of space. And we're using space as a form of spiritual transformation, the travel outward as a journey inward. And I think what's fascinating about it is we're talking to people like MIT and engaging that conversation with people at MIT who've actually launched things at some point into orbit and so forth. So I think it's about that respect and really a sincere collaboration. To me, that the issue of climate and the solution of climate isn't, of course, only scientific. And there's this tendency to say that science answers the important questions. And I think that fundamental statement is where we should challenge. Like, why is the speed of light more important than one's inner peace? Why is the findings of Einstein more relevant or important or urgent in the context of climate change than the findings of Buddha, for instance? I think that both of those things are very important. I think what we're seeing is a tool like science being used by a human like myself, and what, at the end of the day, the human that's operating that tool is really going to affect what that tool does in the world. And I think in a lot of cases you could say, like, the issue is maybe the human issue. It's a spiritual issue. It's an issue of one's insecurities. Like, to me, climate change is a big reflection of human insecurity. You know what I mean? Like, what if that was the solution? Is actually addressing it on that level. But it's not to say that one is prefacing the other, but I think to your point, Liam, it's about a sincere sense of collaboration and a sincere sense of accessibility and how many voices can partake in this thing. And science is an aspect, like not this big grand guider, but an aspect of the solution, just as other things are just aspects, including my storytelling or, Buddha's doctrines. I think they're all a part of that conversation equally. And I believe ecology extends beyond the idea of just the material world. It's an ecology of thinking, an ecology of process, right? Like, in an ecology, you wouldn't preface one aspect in an ecological system over another, because there's a balance that needs to be maintained, and there's a mutual respect amongst all of the entities in an ecological system. And if we extend that to the process of collaboration and world building, it's the same concept. There's no weight heavier on technology or civic engineering or culture. There's a balance that they each maintain. And I believe ecology is less a matter of a field of study and more a mentality. And I think that can be embraced and interchanged with ideas like of collaboration and so on, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I wonder, Drew, briefly, if you could talk a bit about your most recent short film, The Chemical Factory, because I'm thinking here as we move from one description of ecology through work like Holly's to the way that Jeremy's framing it as a kind of a human ecology. Your narrative here might be kind of interesting to talk through, because unless I'm mistaken, your project also centered around a conversation, but one that you had with your mother. Maybe you can talk a bit about what your hopes are for The Chemical Factory and the sort of social impact angle of it, but really just what you were trying to do with the work.
Admittedly, my short film was really more about highlighting a history that's continually trying to be erased by a large entity, which is that specifically is the Chinese Cultural Revolution. For me personally, I being a first generation American, I didn't grow up with children's books or really children's stories. I grew up with stories of my mother and how she escaped China in the 70s, and the danger of escaping that. And a lot of it kind of highlights really specifically how powerful it is for any government entity to have control over a narrative. So much so that even for me, culturally speaking, I feel like my culture of being specifically, not just Chinese, but Cantonese specifically, my Cantonese culture is being erased. Systemically, in the country where it's coming from, they are systematically wiping it out and replacing it with another language. And it's very sad, because I understand the need for it for modernity and how important it is to have a country that can talk to one another. But at the same time, once it's gone, it's something that you will often miss. And with that, not surprisingly, that sort of trauma that my mother had lived through had prepared her for something like the COVID-19 pandemic, where suddenly everything is shut down. In a sense, this isn't the first large-scale trauma she has had to survive through. And a lot of what my anime documentary was about was basically A, highlighting a little bit of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and then B, highlighting what it's like having to go through that trauma again. In a sense, and I felt like it was an important story to tell, because this is not one that people will often find. Some idea of the Cultural Revolution is not something that people would actively seek. So one of the actual struggles I had with working with the film was how to contextualize it for a contemporary audience and how relate it to everybody else. So that's partially also why I purposely jam-packed the COVID-19 pandemic in there, because it did provide a relevance to how it related to the Cultural Revolution through a small thread line. And that kind of technique is kind of what I wanted to highlight of how important it is, or one of the techniques that could be used to employ to basically help change conversation about how we can impact the future in specifically regards to climate change and even social issues. Is as much as we like to think of the narrative as a commonplace, narratives are actually the reason why they work so well. Is actually how the human mind functions and how we best remember things. So.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for that, and a great reminder there, and a note, and perhaps a good leveraging point to open it up to questions. Tanita, you wanted to bring the audience in at this point for some Q&A.
Sure. Why? Please drop your questions in the chat. I have 2 questions already. Charles Speyer is asking, what do the panelists think of Kim Stanley Robinson's effort to build a future fiction combined with potential climate technologies in a ministry for the future?
Is anyone familiar with Kim Stanley Robinson's work? Does anyone want to jump on that question?
I'm not familiar. I will say I'm sorry.
I'm having to do some furious research, meaning Googling right now. I'll be honest.
Maybe as somebody who has read the book, I should venture something. I mean, but I don't have something sophisticated to say. I thought that, it's important to do work like that. I think that a lot of times, we can imagine a future that's out there, but not the process of getting there. This is something he's talked about in his own interviews too, Kim Stanley Robinson. And so one thing I appreciated about that book is it, spelled out some of the steps along that road, which I think is another important part of storytelling.
Yeah, and Stan, I mean, it's really an icon of what we would describe as the climate fiction genre, I think, and a hallmark of his work is a very sincere and real attempt to try and embed his science fiction narratives in scientific collaboration, and he takes that part of his work very seriously. And I think that's part of the reason why Ministry of the Future resonates. I mean, it's just been optioned right now, I think, or at least there's a bidding war going on in town for the rights, and hopefully it finds form in other ways, in other mediums, because it's an important set of stories and arguments. And I mean, a great testament to the fact that, another reason why we're all here is because, of course, the sorts of science fiction that someone like Kim Stanley Robinson writes isn't in any way really about a prediction of a future to come, but it's a much more active process that's actually about looking in on the present moment. I always, say that 1984, the seminal dystopian novel by Orwell, isn't about 1984 at all, but rather it's about 1948, the time in which it was written. And the fact that we kind of are living out a sort of Orwellian present is not because he got it right, but perhaps because he got it wrong, and he didn't frame the fiction in such a way that we took heed and put in place the steps that would prevent that future from coming true. So perhaps Ministry of the Future is something more of a tool than a prediction that we can actually operationalize today. Tanita.
All right, we have another question from Brian Aschenfelter. How will world builders start challenging the established storytelling device that stories begin in an ordinary world? Is a changing climate still considered ordinary?
That's a great question. Drew, do you want to go for it?
I mean, that was kind of the point I was making. That was kind of sad, is that what was considered to be, where you consider changing climate to be sort of out of the ordinary, unfortunately, it is becoming the norm. And part of my job, part of one thing that makes my job work, or if I'm successful, is getting people to believe the images I present are real, even though they're completely works of fiction. And the point I was trying to get across is that in order to get people to believe, you kind of have to show them the familiar. Unfortunately, the familiar now is extreme weather. So, in some ways it's sad that you can show extreme weather and people will accept that as real. You can accept design around extreme weather and accept that as real. And because of that, it does become, in some ways, so ubiquitous it can be boring, which is kind of interesting. The reason why I bring this up is obviously we've seen 20, 30 years of, say, mechs, which are like mech robots you see in a lot of science fiction. And I remember working on a production where someone's like, oh, well, we've all seen what a mech looks like. And I was like, no, you actually haven't, because mechs have always been a work of fiction. There's not an actual mech out there in real life. It's like someone saying oh, we've all seen what mechs look like. It's kind of like saying, oh, we all know what fairies or dragons look like. We don't. They don't exist. They are pure works of fiction. Yet because the image is so strong, people will accept that as real. in an interesting way, which allows it to grow. The point I'm trying to make is that even as a designer, even though I'll be perfectly honest with everyone here, as I have no control over the script. What is part of the conversation is the ubiquity of climate change, how real it is, how present it is. We could use that and turn itself on its face, and maybe the idea of Earth being more temperature controlled, where we don't have such wild swings and change, I think is now quickly becoming the fantasy.
Does anyone else want to jump in on that question? Cool. Tanita, is there another lined up?
I think we need to wrap up soon, but maybe quickly to Holly. Carlo Nicdado is asking, Holly, I'd like to know how you dissect a primary scientific article into your writing.
Yeah, I mean, so I might read a modeling study of a particular technique, whether that's something like enhanced weathering, so speeding up rocks, so the natural processes by which rocks weather, and that sequesters carbon and involves grinding up certain types of minerals into dust and spreading that dust. And so, you see these ideas in the literature, and then you're like, okay, but what about labor? Like, who's doing this work? What's the social relations around it? Is it exploitative, or is it a good job? Is it care labor? Like, thinking about the landscapes, the artifacts, but really the people and the relationships of these abstract ideas that are posed in the scientific literature all the time.
Thank you so much.
I mean, then if we're due to wrap up, then I guess I want to thank all the panelists for being involved. I know, Tanita, you're going to do your own conclusion, but what I'm thinking about after the conversation, and I think one of the big takeaways I hope from the world building panel as part of today's climate summit is really this idea that the future does not rush over us like water. It's something that we all play a very active role in shaping and defining, and in many ways these imaginary worlds can really help us to connect emotionally to the ideas and challenges of our future. So if anything, I hope that today's conversation is really a call to arms. I hope that we all attempt to make stories that really are vessels for critical ideas, Trojan horses hidden within the mediums of popular culture or the products of the Hollywood machine that so valiantly is trying to steer in productive ways. Because inevitably there'll be monsters off the map, and the more we start envisioning speculative new worlds, the more that those uncharted territories where they might dwell become just that little bit smaller. Because ultimately, imaginary worlds and our wanderings through them are really about ultimately returning us to where we first start at the beginning of our journey, to see ourselves and our own cities and our role in the world with new eyes. So thanks so much for the invitation to be a part of this, Tanita, and thanks to Holly and Jeremy and Drew for all giving your time this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you so much. I cannot thank you enough for joining us today. Liam, Holly, Drew, and Jeremy, as well as our incredible audience, has been so interactive and asking incredible questions. Thank you so much. Our aim was really to reflect on our role as caring citizens and to really harness storytelling that can help us to continue to wake up and take life-affirming actions. So thank you so much for joining us today, and please stay on. There's incredible lineup and incredible programming over the next days, and have fun, and thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Holly and Drew. It was a pleasure. Liam and Tanita, see you soon.
It was an absolute pleasure meeting all of you guys. Hope to see you guys soon.